Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and today we are checking out the Siege of Vraks explained by Major Kill. I love Major Kill's videos. I think the Siege of Vraks is really interesting, and as you know, I am taking a look at another Siege of Vraks series, though it's sort of on hiatus while we look at the Death Korps, but this is going to be a great one, and because who doesn't love the Death Korps of Kreig? But before we get started, I want to thank today's video sponsor, M-Teeth. M-Teeth are the makers of the X5 toothbrush, and this is an electric toothbrush. I know what you're thinking. You're like, Paul, an electric toothbrush? Really? Well, here's the thing. What I used to be, probably like a lot of you guys, right, was raised to use a manual toothbrush. You just shake your hand, run it across your teeth, and then your teeth are clean. Well, in the past 30 years since I was first shown how to brush my teeth, there have been a ton of studies that have shown that your teeth actually get a lot cleaner in a lot sooner time with an electric toothbrush. And that sort of makes sense, right? Electric toothbrushes have the additional motor motion in the brush itself, making them more effective than just using your hand to kind of brush around in there. Also, what's really interesting is that for years, since at least the 2010s, studies have shown that people that brush their teeth regularly develop dementia and Alzheimer's at lower rates. And scientists mostly thought that that was because people that do things like brush their teeth every day also do things like eat their vegetables, exercise, and take their prescribed medications. But recent studies have actually found that the bacteria from like gum disease actually also show up in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's. So now scientists think there may actually be some sort of connection between good oral hygiene and good brain health. Again, more research, of course, with anything brain-related, always needed. That said, that's why I think you should get an electric toothbrush. And the M-Teeth makes a great one. The X5 is actually pretty cool. It charges up in just 6 hours and then lasts for 3 months, which is, great for me because I travel a lot, both for work and in all my backpacking and wandering around. So having a toothbrush that's going to stay charged for a long time, always worth it. It also has 3 different modes. It has for sensitive cleaning and then a whitening mode. And for those of you that really want to get it clean. Also, it has an integrated timer that shuts off automatically after 2 minutes, which of course 2 minutes is the length of time the ADA recommends that you spend brushing your teeth. The box itself comes with 3 different styles of brush heads. You can see I'm a regular brush head kind of guy. Also, M-Teeth has a 12-month warranty, and to make it even sweeter, they are offering the X5 for 20% off for everybody. And then check the link in the description. There's a discount code giving you another 30% off for fans of the channel. So that means it's 50% off. So again, if you're like me and you spent the first 20 years of your life with a manual toothbrush, at least for me, I think it's time to upgrade, right? And of course, with all the discount codes, you would be wild, you'd be crazy not to pick up the M-Teeth X5. So thanks again for M-Teeth for sponsoring this video. Now, let's check out the Siege of Vraks.
G'day guys and gal, everyone loves the Death Korps of Kreig, except the Death Korps of Kreig. These dudes and dudettes despise themselves so much that their only goal in life is to die, and for some reason, we find that cute. We need help. Hence I was thinking...
Oh man, it's like all those millennial memes where it's like a SpongeBob meme, but they're like, I have clinical depression. But it's funny because it's SpongeBob. That's probably the most millennial thing, actually.
Thinking about a video I could make on them, but they don't really have chapters or regiments. It's just kind of the Death Korps of Kreig. And due to their...
That's because they just grind through regiments so fast that there's no reason to have a storied regiment.
Characters being a bunch of humorless vat-grown clones that wear gas masks 24/7, it's kind of hard to drill down on specific characters. But then it hit me. The Siege of Vraks. An amazing showcase of the Death Korps, whilst also being a fan favourite moment in the lore.
Yeah, it is.
On top of that, the only person who's really covered it is Arch, but he did so in a...
Is that Arch? I've never seen his actual face. I gotta say, that is a pretty tacky goatee. That's a really bad looking goatee. I mean, goatees just went out of fashion in the 90s, but that... And I acknowledge this as a person who recently had to shave their mustache for work. That questionable facial hair is not something I am above, but again, goatee.
A 43-part series that would nearly take 2 days to watch.
Oh my gosh, I didn't realize the Siege of Vraks actually was 43 parts. Yikes.
To his credit, I heard that he did a good job of it, but I don't have that kind of time, and even if I
don't either, thanks, Major Kill.
did, having to listen to Arch speak for that long would make my attitude towards life align with that of the Kriegsmen. So I thought, bugger it. I can do it in 20 minutes with twice the charm and 100th of the patience. We speedrunning this shit, boy. Speaking...
I love it. Yes. Speedrunning the Siege of Vraks. Ironically enough, the video series covering the Siege of Vraks in many ways is like the Siege of Vraks in that it's needlessly, pointlessly, unnecessarily long and drawn out. And, in some ways, very painful. So I appreciate Major Kill for being like, we're just gonna switch up the Siege of Vraks for like the Siege of Terra, you know? Which was what, like a week? 2 weeks?
Speaking of Arch, guys and gal, we're just over 10,000 subs away from claiming his skull. At this rate, that's about 1 month away. Ever since I was a simple zygote in my mother's uterus, this has been my dream. And boy do I have a fun video planned for when we do overtake him. So grab your cat, grab your cock, and grab your fake online e-girlfriend, and smash that juicy red button. Finish line is in sight.
Hey, just gonna point it out there. Isn't Eldar? Oh, E-girl, Eldar girl. Oh, good one, Major Kill. That's why he's the best.
And boy, will it taste good. Today we'll go over the Siege of Vraks, what the setup was, why it was such a big thing in the...
Does anyone know why Major Kill has a like true to size Custodes helmet? Like, how did he get it, you know? Does it fit him? Is it custom made?
Lore, and what was the end result? We'll be paying special attention to the Death Korps of Kreig, cause you know, they're fucking awesome. Let's get into it. To set the scene, it's the 41st millennium. The galaxy is going through some shit.
Well, that doesn't narrow it down at all. Also, why is this guy who looks a lot like Robert Gulliman bumping Blood Angels colors?
And all the heroes and factions we know and love are out and about. The world of Vraks Prime existed as an important armory world that was led by a newly appointed cardinal called Zafan. See, there's the first issue. An entire star system ruled by a kitty fiddling priest never goes well. Old mate Zafan decided to do a tour of the system to see what worlds were now under his control, and, well, the tour escalated. Due to his intense faith and charisma, he kinda ended up inspiring extreme religious zealousy and holy uprisings to take place on all the worlds he saw.
I mean, if there's one thing we've seen, it's that you don't really need to be all that charismatic to get a weird cult following. I mean, look at all the weird internet personalities that have, like, legit cult followings. And that's just here in, you know, trashy old Terra, you know, ancient Terra, in fact. So who knows what you could do if people were dumber and, of course, more desperate. So that's the other thing that people forget, is that a lot of times people assume beliefs that align with what they already want to be true, right? So if you have a cardinal or a religious figure that tells people that the current order, right, their current lives, which are characterized by suffering and hardship, are the result of a corrupt enemy who wants to ensure, who's both morally incredibly weak and incredibly, like, strong and oppressive, right? That's sort of always the weird dichotomy, is when your enemies are both weak in character but also unrelenting, strong, and requiring only the most unified force to thwart them. And that is, you know, usually when you have these charismatic religious figures in history, there's usually some element of that, right? It usually requires people in great hardship who really want to be able to blame others for it. And again, sometimes justly, look at a lot of religious leaders in the Middle Ages correctly told peasants that the church and their allies in the aristocracy and the landed gentry were in fact the ones who were oppressing them and ensuring that they remained poor and downtrodden. And they were 100% correct. It's just the solution to rally around a probably narcissistic religious leader is not the way to do it.
This started off kind of good. Corrupt, faithless governments and tyrants were toppled, reignited their love for the emperor and their loyalty towards the Imperium.
That's the other thing. You've got to do a couple of things right. Again, you have to kick out the old ruler. You think about the Soviets, right? Who the Bolsheviks seized power, and the first thing they did was end the First World War, Russian involvement in the First World War, and get rid of the Tsar who was so corrupt it was like a parody. And those two things were incredibly popular. And it wasn't until, of course, they started to enact more and more extreme reforms that they started to lose popular support. So again, everyone wanted to see the Tsar go and the war end. Far fewer people wanted to see, private property seized or employers, arrested. And slowly things became more and more unpopular, which culminated, again, not that long, only about, I think, 5 to 7 years later, with the Russian Civil War.
Cardinal Zafan was like, no shit, this is pretty cool. I could totally stop molesting kids and instead use my faith and influence to wipe out all heretics. However, this is Warhammer 40k we're talking about. Shit always goes south. One of Zafan's closest advisors, Deacon Marmon, was a secret chaos worshipper who slowly but surely twisted the Cardinal's perception. He convinced the Cardinal that he was the chosen one, a living saint of the Emperor, and that his vision of heresy was absolute. The extremism set in, and the Cardinal decided that it was time for another holy war against the faithless.
Oh, interesting. See, even Arch doesn't cover that this character. He depicts Cardinal Zafan as being corrupted by sort of his own occupation of the office. And this is always interesting because there are a lot of arguments for actual leaders who do this on both sides. One example is someone like Gaddafi, right? Gaddafi, in the last many decades of his rule, was terrible, was a tin pot dictator who sponsored terrorism and killed a lot of people and was generally corrupt. But at the time he seized power, he was seen as kind of an ideologue and a real reformer. And the question, of course, is, was he always that way and he was just a narcissist putting on a show, tricking people before he could reveal his true face as sort of a narcissistic maniac? Or was it a case of Gaddafi being changed by the office, right? You become so powerful, right, and you're surrounded by so many sycophants that you turn a person into a narcissist, right? A narcissist being, of course, a personality disorder characterized by grandiose ideas of yourself, seeing many things as being attacks, black and white thinking. You should Google the traits of a narcissist because it's really interesting reading, because you probably have met one or two in your real life.
The issue, though, is that by this point, the Cardinals...
But can you create it as an adult, right? By giving someone actually a ton of power and deluding them into believing they're more powerful than they are? I don't know if anyone really knows for sure, but that's one of the arguments that they think happened to people, again, like Colonel Zafan in fiction or Gaddafi in real life. They just sort of buy their own marketing.
Definition of the faithless was pretty different to a lot of others. He took his huge following to Vraks Prime, where he was able to sway the entire planet into believing in him, other than the Adeptus Arbites, but those dudes were always going to be a tough nut to crack. The Inquisition was like, fuck this guy, so they sent a Vindicare assassin to snipe him. However, due to some fancy self-defense device, the bullet was blocked, and the Cardinal survived.
Okay, I'm just going to point some weird stuff out about this depiction of the sniper rifle. So it has an optical, obviously an optical lens on the back end and on the front end, and it has those two dials which are meant to, of course, dial elevation and windage, move the reticle, the crosshairs, relative to the barrel up and down. And that's to both help you zero the rifle at the outset, but also to adjust the point of aim to reflect the distance that the shot will be made. Something that's interesting is, one, that they expect snipers to do that manually, given that in even modern technology, we have been able to, with some prototype rifles, actually automate that distance calculation process, especially in the era of the laser rangefinder, where you can actually get an exact range to a target. Also, what's even more bizarre to me is that again, I know this is like an artist depiction, and the artist is probably just someone who thought Vindicare assassins were cool, but let's talk it out, because why not? Right? The front lens is glowing red. Now, here's the thing. If you're a sniper, especially one like a Vindicare who's wearing all black, probably because they don't want to be seen or noticed, the worst possible thing you can have is a glowing red dot right where your rifle is aiming, right? Because think about it. The scope is a narrow field of view to your target, and the one person you really don't want to see is basically the only person that can see that glowing red light. Your target. Because you can see it's sort of offset. It's sort of pushed back a little bit. And that means that, of course, only who it's pointed at is going to see that. And that is obviously a problem because, duh, you don't want your target to know that you're there. Also, you sometimes have these situations where other light sources will reflect off of the lens of the scope. And supposedly they may have some like anti-reflective stuff. Our scopes, even when I was deployed in Afghanistan, had a sort of mesh cover that prevented significant lens glare from the sun or other light sources, but allowed the user to see through unobstructed. So, I mean, maybe there's some sort of technology out there at work here in the Vindicar, but, you know, maybe if this is a true artist depiction of that particular assassin, maybe he had it coming.
The attempted assassination did seem to back up the Cardinal's point though, hence the entirety of Vraks exploded into rebellion and quickly seceded from the Imperium. Whoops. At this point there wasn't obvious signs of chaos corruption, just a crazy Cardinal who was abusing his power. The world was too defended to just orbitally bomb, plus it was a key supply world, so the Imperium preferred to maintain its infrastructure, hence the Death Korps of Kreig were deployed. Unbreakable men and women with hard-ons for trenches and barbed wire. It was a match made in heaven. The war was to be simple. Send in a bunch of Kriegsmen, watch a lot of Kriegsmen die, watch a lot of Kriegsmen kick ass, and claim victory within 12 years. Yeah, needless to say, that didn't fucking happen. I mean, the Kriegsmen dying and kicking ass part did, but the 12 years, not so much. The Cardinal's army was made up of about 8 million soldiers that were reasonably well armed and trained. They had a lot of supplies and ample time to prepare. They were dug in as fuck. The Imperium was right to send in the Death Korps, but it wasn't taking Vraks super seriously.
So here is what's interesting to me is Vraks is in a lot of ways an illustration for what's happening now. For those of you that are watching in the future, this video is being made almost concurrent with the U.S. or the U.S.-backed Afghan government has basically dissolved entirely, not even put up a fight, and surrendered the country to the Taliban, right? Almost without a shot fired. And it's illustrative because there is a force multiplier of being committed to your cause. And religious fanatics are perhaps the most committed because of their ability to, when you get groups of religious fanatics, they can sort of pump each other up and raise each other's morale. Because, of course, if you're a religious fanatic and everyone around you reminds you that your death is martyrdom, is good and will be honored by God, you know, and no one is around to tell you otherwise and be like, hey, maybe God wouldn't be so cool with you committing suicide or killing civilians, right? Then these units tend to become super strong and super tough and super resilient in terms of their will to fight and their desire to kill for their cause. And this is something that, of course, the U.S. on one side had to face the Taliban, who do have that extreme religious conviction, in addition to being sort of culturally intelligent and integrated into the Afghan fabric and culture, as well as the land itself, right? They're experts in the country. And on the other side, you had this Afghan-backed government that was sort of a generic, general, like, standard Western liberal values type government. But of course, standard Western liberal values are almost completely incompatible with the Afghan traditional values and the Afghan way of life. And when you have that, you can't reconcile the two, right? And this is what we're talking about with Vraks, where you have, the Death Korps of Kreig is also a religious fanatical organization, and they too are sort of indoctrinated heavily in the cult of the Emperor, but they underestimated the fact that these individuals in the Vraksian militia are also equally fanatic, and that becomes the problem, is that fanaticism can overcome a lot of logistical issues, tactical issues, or training issues, right? Fanatics they want to learn. They want to fight. They want to fight well. And experience is its own teacher. And as long as you have people that keep showing up ready to fight, they are going to get smarter and better and more capable. And that is something that, of course, the Kreigs themselves realized, right? That's why they're seen as such an elite fighting force, is their fanaticism makes them get smarter and better trained every iteration. But also, that is something they were facing in the Siege of Vraks, is every time they failed to take an objective, the Vraksian militia would get smarter and better and more capable, making them a more challenging opponent.
They had run the numbers and were confident in their victory. The commanding officer for the siege was also a young, untested man who was put there due to his family's influence and power. They would later come to regret this act of nepotism. Actually landing on the planet wasn't too hard. The Cardinal had grouped his entire fuck-huge army into one multi-layered stronghold, and he didn't have a fleet to prevent the Imperium's arrival. Hence millions of soldiers landed and prepared for war, only a couple thousand k's away from their final target, the Citadel. The war began with the noise of 1,000 Earthshaker cannons opening fire. Both sides began to bomb the shit out of each other. Due to the long range difference, the majority of the shells missed. Using this engagement as a distraction, the Death Korps of Kreig advanced in the enemy position and began setting up trenches to get closer to the target. Over the next little while, these trenches got closer and closer to the enemy's position, whilst artillery and supplies were slowly moved up as well. After a shitload more shelling, and when I say a shitload I mean it, the first of the Death Korps of Kreig bayonet charged at the enemy lines. This did not go well. Thousands of Kriegsmen were cut down by an onslaught of bullets and bombs. Those that had somehow made it to the enemy lines were torn apart by the zealous defenders. Despite literally getting caked in the gore of their fellow Kriegsmen, the second wave of men charged without hesitation and died without hesitation. It was an unstoppable force versus an immovable object situation. Both sides had unlimited morale, so suicidal charges were a huge vibe. After a lot of death, the Kriegsmen stopped charging, which the heretics took as an invitation to have their own suicidal charge. Yeah, needless to say, charging a Kriegsman in his own trench is a terrible idea. Hence the heretics died like the sons of whores they were. By the end of the first 3 days, the sight of mangled corpses and stench of death and gunpowder coated the entire battlefield. The war entered a stalemate. Neither side committed to an all-in charge for over a year, as they instead bombed, sniped, and raided each other where they could.
That is really interesting because that's not terribly different from how the actual First World War played out. We think of it classically as being a conflict between two entrenched sides shelling each other with occasional suicidal charges. But in fact, in the first maybe 90 days of the war, the lines were extremely fluid, and armies were constantly marching, engaging, marching back, setting positions, and don't get me wrong, doing a lot of killing. A lot of people died early. But the thing to remember is that in this First World War, you really had a lot of dynamic movement, but only in those first 90 days. And once sort of the line stabilized and defensive positions were able to be enforced or reinforced, then you had this long period of relatively static war. And so I imagine, not by accident, the same thing seems to have happened at Vraks. The Death Korps and the Vraxian militia both slaughter each other kind of wholesale, very dynamically, very quickly, and very suddenly, followed by long periods of lower intensity conflict.
Despite the lack of Leroy Jenkins tier charging, thousands were still dying each day. Eventually, the Death Korps were able to break through a small chink in the heretics' armor. Some Kriegsmen got into the enemy bunkers and desperately fought to hold their gains, whilst reinforcements arrived. If it had been anyone else, the heretics could have pushed them out and resumed the stalemate. But these were the guys and gal of Kreig. More Kriegsmen poured into the breach, and after some intense close-quarter combat, which involved a lot of flamethrowers and bludgeoning bitches with shovels, the outer walls and defences of Vraks had fallen. It appeared to be time to attack the second layer of defense. Except it fucking wasn't! A huge enemy counterattack was launched that caught the Imperial forces off guard. Dozens of thousands on each side died daily as the war turned into an absolute mess. Consolidating ground became nearly impossible. This back and forth battle continued for quite a long time, both sides gaining then giving up ground. It honestly made the first part of the war look like a jello fight with a
Yeah, this is a World War I style illustration.
Brazilian prostitute. After 7 years of fighting, shit hit the fan.
Magicoon, I feel like the shit had already hit the fan. You know, cause millions of people have died.
Shut your fucking mouth, Timmy, before I sign you up to singing Cardinal Zapfan's sermons. Yes, things had been hectic, but it was about...
So, okay, this is also a little interesting because in the First World War, you had this period where, yes, the German forces were trying to actively counterattack and actually push off the Allied forces. But what happened over time when Germany realized they would never have the industrial base or the competent enough allies to really compete with the Allied forces, that they decided on a new strategy, and their goal became a war of attrition. And they were able to basically accept that they would not be doing any more charges, any more efforts to gain ground, and instead their goal was just to kill as many Allied troops as possible, as efficiently as possible. And to do that, what they would do is develop these extremely tight, interlinked bunker networks, trench lines, where they would bait the enemy to charge, kill them, make them seize this trench line, and the Germans would, of course, retreat back, having booby-trapped their old trenches, ensuring that tons more Allied soldiers were killed as they tried to seize the trenches, and the trenches would be organized in such a way that they were excellent targets from another trench line further back. And so the Allies, far from having seized ground, would actually be in an even worse shooting gallery from a trench line where the Germans had relocated. And so their options were, of course, either retreat or charge again, but the Germans would be able to fall back again. And this was an extreme war of attrition, but Germany's entire strategy was to not take unnecessary casualties. And that's one of the things that's interesting here, is that I don't know if Major Kill is glossing over it. Again, lore experts, I defer to you. But that you would like to see the Vraxian militia would be more conservative with their lives because they weren't infinite, right? They were fixed. And so they would be, I feel like, more likely to do what's called the defense in depth, where you retreat back through positions. That's what the Germans did.
About to get even more so. See, a bunch of Alpha Legionnaires came out of fucking nowhere and bolstered the defenders of Vraks. The reasoning is not entirely clear, as the appearance of the Traitor Marines sparked an extreme response for the Imperium in turn. I believe that Amigon sent those Marines in to make the Imperium take Vraks more seriously, so the Imperium could achieve victory. Because, you know, Amigon, or maybe Alfarius, is loyalist. The first to answer this call were the Dark Angels. Oh shit! Who quickly went about sabotaging and taking over the enemy's starport, which deprived the enemy of easy access to off-world reinforcements and supplies. This is Vraks though, so while I do stand by the fact that it was quick, A shitload of Dark Angels died, a mega fuctillion heretics died, and a whole bunch of Alpha Legionnaires died. After 9 years, there was no end in sight, and the grueling high casualty war continued. Each meter of ground that the Death Korps of Kreig claimed could be measured in the blood of thousands. But eventually, through extreme effort and strokes of tactical genius, the heretics were losing ground. If it wasn't abundantly clear by now, Cardinal Zerfan was now a chaos-worshipping fanatic. I love the jump from, "I am literally Jesus," to, "I suck Satan's cock," that he did, but hey, the path to hell is paved with good intention.
I mean, again, it's really interesting just to see how people can change over time. I mean, you look at like the number of celebrities that do that experience radical changes in both their demeanor and also their politics. But usually, and of course we all have that aunt, uncle, cousin, brother that had one political alignment that was towards the center, and then over time that alignment swings way towards the extremes. And the truth is, you can do that pretty easily with a person. You just have to control their sources of information, as we've seen. If you give people different information, if you replace, ABC News with Peter Jennings with, patriotnews.net or whatever the latest TikTok influencer is promoting, then you are going to end up adopting those extremist beliefs. That's also how advertising works, right? I mean, if you drive around on the highway and you look at billboards, look at the actual message of the billboard. Often, they don't have a core proposition, a value proposition. They're not saying, the Whopper, it's affordable and delicious, right? That's like a value proposition. Instead, they're just like, burger. And you're just like, okay, like you're just trying to instill in me normalizing this thing, right? You're appealing to my sort of subconscious, right? You're conditioning me to see, Burger King and burger and a picture of a juicy burger together. And so that's what you can do, I would argue, with if you wanted to corrupt someone to chaos, is that you would just have to normalize it. Again, over 9 years, that's a long time. And a person may not even realize that they're being normalized. Once you control the information, as they discussed, the Cardinal's chief of staff was already a chaos worshiper, so it would be easy to provide them with the information that makes it seem like a logical next step to adopt more and more chaos-aligned beliefs, i.e., the emperor isn't real, the emperor's a heretic, the emperor actually would worship chaos, etc., etc.
With his mortal army failing him, Zerfan allowed his chaotic sorcerers to perform their magic. Foremost, they sent out a signal, an invitation. Vraks was a fucking blood orgy and everyone is invited. A huge armada of chaos ships formed and beeline for Vraks. Despite a valiant effort by Imperial ships to stop them, the Armada was able to unload a shitload of bad guys onto the planet, including World Eaters and Iron Warrior Space Marines. Shit just hit the fan. Again. While the
volume of shit just keeps overwhelming progressively bigger fans, is what I'm hearing here.
Chaos Fleet had been heading over, the legendary armies of Kreig once again attacked the enemy's position. The Citadel was the most fortified structure on the planet by far, and taking it would be a bitch, but for the last decade, Kreig had been fucking bitches, so they charged onwards and inch by inch made more and more ground. And that's when it all went to hell. The huge load of bad guys had arrived, and they did so in style. All the gains that the armies of the Imperium had suffered for years to make were wiped out in an instant. Cornite berserkers tore through Kriegsmen like butter. The Death Korps fought on valiantly, but they just weren't ready for this kind of shit. The enemy's outer defenses were re-established, and the end of the war, which was in sight, was now cast into doubt. It now appeared that a genuine Chaos victory was more than possible. Oh yeah, and the traitors had brought Titans with them. Feck. With things...
I mean, at that point, they've got to decide that this is exterminatus worthy.
In such a disastrous state, the High Commander of the Siege of Vraks was fired, and replaced with a much more experienced and trusted leader. He requested the support of Titans, more firepower, and more soldiers, as the Death Guard began arriving on Vraks and turning large parts of it into a decayed cesspit. At this point, it wasn't even the Siege of Vraks anymore, it was the clusterfuck of Vraks. There was no defined battle lines, and the objective wasn't even to take the Citadel anymore. It was to survive until the Titans arrived, and then hopefully they could do their work. The Cardinal wasn't remotely in charge anymore. He had no command over any of the traitor space marines running around, nor did he control the legions of cultists, mutants, and beastmen they had brought with them. Even his own...
Okay, what's also interesting is when you have these commands break down, something else that happens is that a lot of soldiers just start to do whatever they want. That's usually things like looting, destroying civilian targets, etc., etc. And this is even true even among religious fanatics, because even fanatics have the same basic biological impulses as you and I do, which is, of course, the desire for more stuff, delicious food, and sometimes, on some level, to destroy things in dramatic fashion.
Own men were kind of doing their own thing, so no, he just sat in his bunk.
Though it seems possible that the presence of Space Marines who aren't human beings and have a much stronger moral compass might become little mini theater commanders and rally the Kriegsmen around them to battle.
Poured himself a pint and waited for the whole thing to blow over. The Imperium was...
So what's also interesting is that I'd be curious to know if Krieg, what their military doctrine is. Because in the First World War, again in siege warfare style doctrines, the rule was if you execute the last order you're given, and and when you're done, until you receive more orders, you basically remain and fight in place. In modern military doctrine, especially in the United States, they instruct units, and units are informed of their higher level headquarters intention at least 2 levels up. And that is done so that as the situation becomes strange or situation becomes unlike anything in the plan, those individual subordinate units are expected to take action understanding what the ultimate objective of their headquarters is. And that, of course, demands a more dynamic level of junior leader, but it can also be really effective because even when command gets taken out, soldiers continue to fight on, and sometimes in ways that are very dynamic and very hard to follow. In some ways, harder to follow because absent a strategy, right, you just have a series of sort of spasmodic advances, feints, withdrawals, charges, last stands, and it can be really hard to discern the overall strategy if there even is one. So I'd be curious to know if Krieg, absent an effective command structure, if a Kriegsman is instructed to dig in and fight until the death, or if they are instructed to charge the enemy, or simply to do some sort of follow last given order.
Tired, worn down and wounded, and incredibly pissed off. So very, very pissed off. So pissed, in fact, that they were like, fuck this shit, let's counterattack. So after a year of consolidating and preparing, they sent in everything they had. All the men, tanks, titans and bombs that they could. Once more the men and women of Krieg charge, bayonets ready, into oblivion. Ground was gained, many died, titans fought titans as Chaos Marines tore through guardsmen. It was pretty fucking sweet. After a few days, the loyalists were winning. A dozen chaotic titans brought down, a ton of dead traitor marines.
A dozen chaos titans is a wild number of titans.
And countless heretical cocksuckers were massacred. Things were looking up, but the war was not yet done. At the same time as that engagement, the Imperial forces had sent thousands of men to dig underground and blow up a bunch of shit. After a year of digging and dying, you know, hard to run away from a Cornite berserker when you're underground, they also succeeded, and boy did they blow some shit up. As we know by now, any progress the armies of the Imperium would make would be short-lived, and sure enough, the next line of defense appeared to be impossible to crack. The enemy had plenty of planes, fortifications, and a way better position. On top of that, the Chaos Space Marines were still wrecking absolute tits. Not all the Titans could be committed to the curtain wall, as they were still needed on the flanks, especially the ones where Chaos Astartes were present. Another year passed, millions more died, and next to no ground was gained. The Imperial forces were out of the come zone, but the result of the war was still uncertain.
I mean, the other thing that's kind of weird and that doesn't make sense to me is the more this becomes a bloodbath, the more empowered and the more frequent all Cornate stuff will be, right? You'll have more Khornate Berserkers, more Khorne worshippers, more potentially Khorne demons, and maybe even a demon prince, based on the fact that this is one of the greatest, sounds like one of the largest slaughters in a universe that's characterized by a lot of large slaughter. So if you're the Imperium, or you're the Inquisition, you must surely know this. And to me, that would be the time to withdraw and glass the planet, because nothing is worse than having a stronghold of chaos inside Imperial space.
They needed that special source to break through. The fact that the High Lords of Terror were no longer vibing Vraks and would begin to reduce the amount of resources available, hence extending the siege out for a dozen more years, didn't help at all. The High Commander was like, ah, fuck, and he knew that he had about a year or two to win the war or it would never be won. Hence he enlisted the aid of the Red Scorpion Space Marines, who were like, fuck yeah, and then they just straight up teleported a bunch of Terminators into the heart of the enemy forces. Metal as fuck. The enemy was in disarray, which is common when a bunch of—
I've never heard of the Red Scorpions chapter. Is that something they made up like for the books, or is it like a homebrew campaign, or is it just a chapter that I'm just not familiar with?
Of Terminators teleport right in front of you and murder the shit out of you and your mates. With this breach in the enemy lines secured, progress could once again be made, and holy shit, no expense was spared. It kind of feels like I'm that dude from that old surf video.
You just drop in and just smack the lip, whoop-ah, drop down, snap, ah.
With how I'm explaining these battles, but that's kind of how it was. Led by an army of Space Marines, the Death Korps of Kreig, a fuckload of tanks, and some Titans, the Imperial forces were able to push through to the next line of defense. All that stood in the Imperium's path to the Citadel was the Great Curtain Wall. The Red Scorpions withdrew to honor their dead, and victory was in sight. Until it fucking wasn't. So the Inquisition saw the future, and the future said that in an act of bad sportsmanship, the last defenders of Vraks would let demons rape their tits and turn the entire planet into a demon world, which would be a huge pain in the ass for the Imperium. Hence Inquisitor Lord Hector Rex took command of the entire war, adding inquisitorial troops, including fucking Grey Knights, to the effort. The Red Hunters, who drink Inquisitor cum like Kool-Aid, also—
How did the Inquisitor see the future? That seems like a lot. Or is that just the Inquisitional psychers just helping them out? And also, if they could see the future, why didn't they weigh in on this, like, you know, in the first 17 years?
To join the effort, whilst envoys were sent out to see if the Dark Angels and the Red Scorpions wanted to return to Vraks to finish what they started. There would be one final mega push, the Battle of all battles. All the defenders had gathered to protect the Curtain Wall. Plague zombies rose in their thousands. Khornate Berserkers prepared to charge. Absolute chaos erupted as toxic gas, lasfire, and the unending thum of artillery exploded everywhere. Thousands more died, and finally, after over a decade of fighting, the defenders' morale began to collapse as defeat seemed inevitable. But Lord Zulfor, the leader of the Skulltakers, who were a Khornate warband, wouldn't have a bar of it. Zulfor began to unite the various chaotic warbands into a unified force. It's kinda ironic that a Khornate Berserker would be the one to do that. He killed numerous Chaos Lords and took their forces for himself, before throwing Cardinal Zafan into a cage. He was now lord of whatever was left of Vraks, and he intended to inflict as much death and bloodshed as possible with a unified force, and the potential for a fuck-huge demonic army at his back if he could build a warp portal in time.
So, this is also sort of interesting because it sounds like he has realized we've now switched to sort of a Spanish Civil War vibe. And that's because in the Spanish Civil War, of course, you had two sides. You had basically the organized Spanish military, or a large portion of it, and you had Republican Spain, which was an armed force raised up by the legitimate government of Spain, the democratically elected republic. And so in order to stand up an army when your existing army is trying to kill you, what they generally did was they relied on things like extremist political parties, militia, labor unions. The problem is, of course, is that these are so ideologically disparate that there was almost no way to get them all unified under the same command. They hated each other and were routinely fighting one another almost as much as they tried to fight the Spanish nationalist army. To make matters even worse, right, the Spanish nationalist army was way better equipped and way better funded than the Republican army. So what you had in effect is this realization that against a unified command, you just weren't going to succeed. You just weren't going to have a chance. And I think even though Khorne loves bloodshed, I think this Khornate warband leader realized that. He realized that to maximize their effectiveness with the limited forces they had, that they had to come under the same banner. And only by doing that, by exerting what the military doctrine calls unity of effort, right, that's everyone pulling in the same direction, will they be able to achieve their ultimate objective, which is maximizing slaughter.
While Zul'Far was staging his coup, the defenders on the curtain wall finally collapsed. Too many had died. They had no more food or ammunition. After penetrating wall after wall, line after line, the citadel was in sight, the final target to bring this vicious war to an end. After some preparation and political meddling by external forces, what was left of the armies of Kreig charged forward onto their final target, as the united force of Lord Zul'Far charged out to meet them. A huge battle raged, where demonic activity was becoming more and more apparent. The Grey Knights, who had been in reserve, were finally deployed and they joined the fighting. This battle would go on for months. I'm honestly beyond describing how fucked it is.
Thank you, Major Kill.
I feel exhausted thinking about that. When you hear the phrase final push, you think, oh yeah, a couple hours, last push, win the day. Nah, not at Vraks, where a final push can take years. The Imperial forces reached the Citadel, and they began climbing up its slopes. This would be the most vicious part of the entire war. Honestly, you'd have a higher survival rate if you jumped into a meat grinder than this final part of the story. The Death Korps of Kreig knew this, and pushed onwards anyway. Each meter of ground they claimed was met with disaster. Trap after trap was sprung, and even loyalist space marines were like lambs to the slaughter, with the Red Hunters losing 150 brothers in one engagement.
Wow, that's almost unbelievable.
Even the god machines of Mars were being taken down. Still, the attackers pushed onwards, with the Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex personally leading the battle from the front. It was only due to his efforts and the Grey Knights that they were finally able to get a good foothold in the Citadel, but the battle was far from over. For the next part of the most drawn-out final push in the history of Warhammer lore, the Red Scorpions had returned in force, and were ready to finish what they started 5 years ago. The assistance of the Red Scorpions was a huge asset for the Loyalists, as it forced the Defenders, or whatever the fuck was left of them, to reveal their trap card, an entire legion of Khornate Demons. Nice. The Red Scorpions fought through the Demons and secured their objective. Now it was up to Lord Hector Rex.
Okay, what is with those Star Wars Stormtrooper inspired helmets? Seems kind of weird.
And his
good one, GW.
Grey Knights to push through the front, whilst an army of Kriegsmen breached the underground catacombs and launched their attack from there. Now Hector wasn't just some snotty-nosed inquisitor. The man was a beast and was personally blessed by the Emperor. Like, he wore hectic Inquisitor power armor and he led Grey Knights from the front. As Hector and friends cut their way through brass demons, bloodletters and other nasty red things, boss music started playing. Angrath, the mightiest of the Bloodthirsters, emerged, and he licks it.
Sorry, is the Bloodthirsters a type of demon, or is it a chaos warband of space marines?
Grey Knight tits. Almost the entirety of Hector's Astartes squad was wiped, until it was just him and the angry demon. Hector, being the beast that he is, somehow managed to 1v1 the greatest bloodthirster around, and he sent the monster screaming back to hell. As Angrath was banished, the Dark Angel successor chapter, the Angels of Absolution, arrived. They were like, yo, we will help you, but we call dibs on the Alpha Legionnaires. And Hector was like, what? Why? You know what? Fuck it. Sure, you can have him. I am sick of this shit. With
Is that a thing? All Dark Angels want to kill all Alpha Legion?
Angrath banished and the Angels' arrival, the battle was more of a massacre than anything. Very few traitor marines remained. Most had died and even more had fled. Even Zul'Far, the Lord of Khorne, had left the planet. His objective to rack up the highest possible body count had been achieved.
It's like when you're going for the Guinness Book of World Records, like most deaths in a single game, you're just like, well, everything after this is just bonus.
Ironically, the Alpha Legionnaires who first arrived on Vraks and who invited all the other Traitor Marines to join the fun were still around. That's right, the slippery Alpha Legion performed a last stand and were cut down and captured to the man by the Dark Angels, whilst the Berserkers of Khorne retreated to fight another day. What the fuck? So by this point, the last of the defenders were literally just batshit insane mutants who had been twisted by the warp. The last time a sane heretical soldier had been encountered on Vraks was some time ago.
Yeah, I always wonder that, like, what would happen if you had someone who really, there was no R&R, they were just in battle continuously. I imagine that it's probably would happen in places maybe like Stalingrad. You would see something like that, of just like an almost unconceivable level of suffering and bloodshed, and how would it affect someone's psyche? I would love to see studies of this if these sort of things scale up. And we know that when people are traumatized and experience these like traumatic events, that a large portion of them, especially if they're young, really get affected the rest of their lives. We obviously know a lot about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and how that can affect some people. But what is interesting is that we don't really know, thankfully, I guess, if it scales, right? Because the last time there was like an industrial level of warfare, the Second World War, or a single unit that spent, 3 years in continuous combat, right? Or a year, or even like, I will say a year. It was just a long time ago. And so soldiers get breaks in between, right? They get rotated off the front line, even in the First World War. If you are in continuous combat for months and months and months, it's because some system is failing. So that I would be really curious to know about the psychology of these sort of prolonged battles. I imagine that it would create a more severe and more chronic form of PTSD, right? That instead of having like jumping at fireworks, you would be waking up at night screaming or even like hallucinating, which is one of the things that happens in the most severe forms of PTSD.
Whilst these demonic defenders were able to give you nightmares, they were no match for the Death Korps of Kreig with their Space Marine allies. Soon the last of the demons were banished and their warp portal was destroyed. Any remaining defenders were put out of their misery. The cardinal who started it all, Mr. Zarfan, was found, and boy oh boy did he get his share of karma. He had been turned into, I kid you not, a Down syndrome mass of writhing tentacles. Not in like a boss battle way, I mean in like a severely disabled way. The Grey Knights incinerated him. 14 million dead Kriegsmen, all 8 million defenders killed, hundreds of Space Marines lost, dozens of Titans fallen, countless tanks destroyed, and millions upon millions of artillery shells expended. For the entire 17 years, there was non-stop artillery bombardment. The Death Korps of Kreig had been sent feet first into hell, and they had emerged on the other side.
Someone had emerged, but none of the original, I'm sure.
The regiment could have achieved what they did.
There must have been like one Kriegsman from the original battle that survived, and he or she must be a train wreck. I don't even know what Kreig would do with them. Like, they would almost have to be psychologically destroyed. I mean, just seeing a demon is enough to destroy most guardsmen. Imagine fighting them for decades.
No other regiment would be able to endure the horrors of...
I mean, even if he was a little psychologically intact, he would have to be taken and like dissected for study to understand what in his brain enabled him to survive that.
Vraks and come out sane. They had fought every nightmare Chaos had to throw at them, and they were not found wanting. The Siege of Vraks wasn't a planet-wide war, it was literally a siege of one hyper-defended fortress. By the end of the war, Vraks was so damaged and corrupted that any hopes of reclaiming its armories and supplies was long gone. The entire system was put into quarantine and declared a no-fly zone, and the veterans of Vraks were shipped off to new war zones soon after. So what did we learn today, team? Well, sometimes just exterminating your problems at the start is the way to go. Electing religious fanatics as leaders isn't a smart idea.
Also, this is so far sound advice.
And using an army of 15-year-old vat-grown clones with gas mask glued to their face is fucking awesome. If you enjoyed the video...
I did enjoy the video. I always enjoy the video. There, major kill. That said, yeah, I think what are my lessons learned here? Yeah, definitely you have to consider that things will get drawn out. And often the slowly escalating problem-solving strategy is often not the best one. Sometimes your best bet is just to be safe. Better to be safe than sorry. This is, for example, like when your doctor looks at a small infection and goes, we are going to give you 10 days of antibiotics, because what we don't want to do is treat it with a 2-day course and maybe it'll go away, but maybe it'll become antibiotic resistant. They go, nope, we are going to our starting treatment protocol is a very, very powerful prescription. And that is because sometimes you using a graduated amount of force is all you're doing is training your enemy to fight you better. Of course, it's hard to know, right? No one wants to hear that they used too much versus not enough. All right. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Thanks again to today's video sponsor, Mteeth. And be sure to hit the subscribe button. Check out the merch store down below. Check out the second channel. I have new shirts at the merch store. And I will see you guys next time.